This is the history of spaceflight and space technology. I'm Andy Chaikin. This is week 7, Apollo 9 through Apollo 11. Well, after the success of Apollo 8, that bold and historic flight around the moon, NASA really had new confidence that they could forge ahead to accomplish Kennedy's challenge of landing humans on the moon, returning them safely to the Earth before the end of the decade. And the next step, now that the lunar module was ready to fly, was the first complete test of the Apollo spacecraft in Earth orbit, and that was the goal of the Apollo 9 mission. And now that there were going to be 2 spacecraft, just to identify them on the radio transmissions, they gave their spacecraft names, and the lunar module, which kind of looked like a big robotic insect, for Apollo 9 got named Spider, and the command and service modules was named Gumdrop. And here you see them being checked out at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Here's the crew for Apollo 9. In the center you see Jim McDivitt, who was a space veteran. He'd been the commander of Gemini 4. And on the right you see the command module pilot, Dave Scott, who, of course, had flown with Neil Armstrong on the very harrowing and nearly disastrous Gemini 8 flight. And on the left, the lunar module pilot, Rusty Schweickart, a rookie. And actually, the term lunar module pilot is a little bit of a misnomer, since he really didn't do any flying. He was more of a systems engineer. But there you have the crew of Apollo 9. Lifted off on March 3rd, and once they got into Earth orbit, here's what happened. They separated from the third stage of the Saturn V. Big panels went flying away. This is Dave Scott now at the controls of the command and service modules, and he's turning the spacecraft using those little reaction control thrusters. Now he's nosing the docking mechanism into the roof of the lunar module. He gets a good solid link up with the docking latches, and then extracts the lunar module from the third stage, and it's time to carry out the mission. Now, it was shortly after they linked up that they opened the tunnel. They removed the docking mechanism from the tunnel between the 2 spacecraft. They then open the hatches, and this opens up a kind of passageway between the command module and the lunar module. And you can see on the left what it was like. If you're in the command module, in order to go through that overhead hatch, that docking hatch, you're pretty much going towards what seems to be the ceiling of the command module. And yet, when you get into the lunar module, you now find that by its layout, you are coming in from the ceiling pointing down. So your whole frame of reference gets turned upside down as you go from the command module into the LEM. And on the right there, you can see that even if you stay in the command module, your frame of reference is pretty much a toss-up. On the right is Jim McDivitt, and on the left is Rusty Schweickart. It's up to you to decide who's right side up and who's upside down, since in zero gravity and weightlessness, there is no up or down. Now, this is a great deal of fun, but it also can play havoc on the inner ear. And in fact, that's what happened to Rusty Schweickart. As he started to move around in zero-G, and remember that in Apollo they had much more room to move around, basically the inner ear starts sending some signals that conflict with what the eye is seeing. In weightlessness, you're basically in a condition of free fall, and so your inner ear is telling your body that you're falling. Well, your eyes are telling your body something else. You have no visual sensation of falling, and you're either aligned with what you think is up or down or sideways or whatever in the cabin. So this produces two conflicting sets of sensory data. In fact, doctors call it sensory conflict. And that sensory conflict can make you sick. And as I say in the title here, this is the dark side of zero-G. Rusty Schweickart experienced a form of space motion sickness early in the flight as he was checking out the lunar module. And he actually threw up a couple of times, felt crummy, and there was some real concern about how long it would take him to recover from this and whether he would be able to carry out his role in the rest of the mission. Now, recall that Frank Borman had gotten sick on Apollo 8, but he had dismissed that as the effects of a sleeping tablet that he'd taken on the way out to the moon. And he certainly, Borman being the kind of macho guy that he was certainly not about to go volunteer to be studied by the NASA doctors to see if he was susceptible to space motion sickness. Of course, that's hard to figure out on the ground anyway, since people don't necessarily experience the same symptoms that they would in space, just undergoing tests on the ground, or for that matter, even in the zero-G aircraft that they use to train in weightlessness. So this was really a new phenomenon for NASA to be confronted with. And as I say, it caused some concern. They didn't know whether or not Rusty would be able to carry out his assigned role, but he did recover, and a couple days later, in fact, he was able to go ahead and take a spacewalk to test the new moon suit, the pressure suit that would be used on the moon, with its life support backpack. And what you see on the right is Rusty in his self-contained pressure suit and backpack, and his visor, a moon sun visor, and the moon gloves. And he's making his way up a handrail as if he were going to transfer from the lunar module to the command module. And this was actually an important procedure. You can imagine that coming back from the surface of the moon, if they tried to dock with the command module and had some malfunction in the docking mechanism, well, then the only way for the commander and the lunar module pilot to get back to the command module would be to open the hatches of both craft and have them spacewalk from one to the other. Well, that's what he was essentially demonstrating here without going all the way up to the command module, because there was still some concern that, you know, he ought to take it a little bit easy, having just gotten over his space sickness. But he stayed outside for about an hour. Everything worked great. And on the left, you can see Dave Scott, the command module pilot, standing in the, or floating in the open hatch of the command module gumdrop. And he was sort of taking pictures of Rusty and retrieving some experiment packages from the outside of the spacecraft, and just basically participating in this spacewalk. And it was a great milestone for the mission, and now that Schweickart was just fine, he was able to check out that equipment, that very important equipment. Okay, in the next segment, we'll continue with Apollo 9.